I felt the stitches pull when the wheelchair attendant helped me stand, and I gritted my teeth and smiled anyway. Because that was easier than explaining to a stranger why my husband wasn't the one helping me up. "Mrs. Calloway, you're all set," the nurse said, tucking a folded blanket around my son's tiny shoulders. "Congratulations again. He's a beautiful boy." "Thank you," I said, and looked past her toward the hallway, where my husband stood with his phone in one hand and his car keys spinning around his other finger, the way he did when he was bored and wanted everyone to know it. 5 days. 5 days since I'd had an emergency C-section at 11 at night. Since I'd bled more than the doctors liked. Since I'd lain in a recovery room, listening to my own heartbeat on a monitor and wondering, in that strange drugged haze, whether my husband would even make it to the hospital before visiting hours ended. He had. Eventually, he'd stayed for 40 minutes, kissed my forehead like he was checking a box, and gone home to sleep in our bed while I slept in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm. I told myself that was just how some men were. Practical. Undemonstrative. My mother-in-law called it even-keeled, like it was a virtue. "Ready?" Holt said, not looking up from his phone. "I think so." I shifted him August. After no one in particular, just because I liked the way it sounded, like warmth, like the last good month of summer. Against my chest, and followed my husband down the hallway, my legs unsteady, my whole lower body still humming with the dull ache of healing. We came out into the cold. October in Minneapolis doesn't apologize for itself. The wind cut straight through my cardigan, and I curled my body around August like a shell. I expected the SUV. Holt had bought it the year before, a black Range Rover he loved more than he loved talking about his feelings, and I assumed it would be idling in the pickup lane the way it always was when he picked me up from anywhere. Instead, he walked past the parking garage entirely, past the valet stand, out toward the street. "Holt?" I called after him, my voice catching the cold air and turning rough. "Where are you going? Aren't we taking the car?" He turned around, and for one absurd second I thought he was joking. He wasn't. "I need the car for tonight," he said. "My mother's hosting dinner. The whole family's coming. I told you about it last week. You didn't tell me anything about tonight." I shifted August again. My arms were starting to shake. "I just had surgery 5 days ago, Holt. I need to get home. There's a bus stop right there." He pointed like he was being helpful. Like this was a reasonable thing to say to a woman holding a newborn who could barely stand up straight. "It's, what, 4 stops? You'll be home before I even get to my mom's." I stared at him. I kept waiting for the part where he'd laugh and say he was kidding, where he'd put his arm around me and walk me to the car like every commercial I'd ever seen for what a husband was supposed to be. The part never came. "You want me to take the city bus?" I said slowly. 5 days after a C-section. With a newborn. In this weather, it's not that big a deal. People do it all the time. He was already turning, already walking toward the garage. "I'll see you at home later. Don't wait up. It might run late." And then he was gone, and I was standing on a curb outside Hennepin County Medical Center with my 5-day-old son against my chest, watching my husband disappear into a parking structure to retrieve the car I had in fact paid for. Though he didn't know that, not really, not the way it actually mattered. I want to explain something here, because I know how it sounds. I know what it looks like when a woman says her husband didn't know where her money came from. It sounds like a lie people tell themselves, or a detail invented after the fact to make a sad story sound more satisfying. But it was true, and it was true because I had built it that way, brick by brick, on purpose. My father is Whitford Lang. If that name means nothing to you, that's exactly how he likes it. He built a chain of boutique hospitality properties, small, design-forward hotels in cities that didn't already have one. The kind of places that get written up in travel magazines without ever putting his name on the marquee, starting with one converted warehouse in Minneapolis when I was 11 years old. By the time I was in college, there were 19 of them. By the time I met Holt, there were 31, and my father had become the kind of wealthy that doesn't show up in tabloids because it never needed to be loud. I grew up watching what money did to people who found out about ours too early. I watched friends' parents start asking me to put in a good word with my dad about investment opportunities. I watched a boyfriend in college propose to me 4 months into dating, with a ring he absolutely could not afford, the week after he met my father at a school event. I decided, somewhere around 22, that I wanted to be loved for the version of me that didn't come with a balance sheet attached. So when I met Holt at a friend's barbecue, he was a third-year associate at a mid-size law firm, sharp-jawed and a little vain in a way I found charming back then. I told him my name was Adeline Reyes, my mother's maiden name, the name I'd used on every dating app and every introduction since college. I told him my father ran a small chain of motels, which was technically not even a lie, just a description so understated it became one. I let him assume what people assume about a woman who works as a freelance interior consultant and drives a leased sedan and splits the check on the second date. He never asked very many questions, which I used to think was a kind of trust. I understand now it was something closer to disinterest. The only piece of my old life that ever followed me into our marriage was the car. My father had given me the Range Rover for my 28th birthday, before Holt and I were married, registered in my name, paid for in full. After the wedding, Holt simply started driving it, the way some men absorb their wife's things without ever quite acknowledging where they came from. I let him. It was easier than explaining. The bus stop smelled like wet concrete and exhaust. I sat on the narrow plastic bench with August against my chest, both of us wrapped in the receiving blanket the hospital had sent us home with, and I watched my own breath fog in front of my face, and I thought, with a kind of dull, exhausted clarity, this is who I married. The bus took 26 minutes. I counted every one of them. A teenager offered me his seat, which made me want to cry more than anything else that had happened all day. And I thanked him and sat down and held my son, and stared out the window at a city I had lived in my whole life, suddenly feeling like a stranger passing through it. When I got home, the apartment was cold and empty, and there was no food in the refrigerator except a half-empty jar of pickles and some expired oat milk. I hadn't expected Holt to cook. I had expected, maybe, that he'd have thought about the fact that his wife was coming home from major surgery to an apartment with nothing in it. He texted me around 9. Dinner ran long. Mom wants to keep the car overnight. I'll grab a ride back. Don't wait up. I sat on the couch with August asleep on my chest, and I thought about my own mother, who died when I was 16, and how she used to say that the truth about a person isn't in the big moments, the proposals and the anniversaries. It's in the small ones, the ordinary Tuesday moments when no one is performing for anyone. This had been an ordinary moment. Holt hadn't performed cruelty. He'd simply been, without effort, exactly who he was. I should tell you that this wasn't an isolated incident, though it was the worst one. Over our 2 years of marriage, the contempt had been building in small, deniable increments. Comments about how my freelance thing wasn't really a career. Jokes at dinner parties about how he was carrying our household financially. A habit of introducing me to his colleagues as my wife. She does some design work, in a tone that made the achievement sound like a hobby a child might have. I had absorbed all of it the way you absorb water damage in a ceiling, slowly and visibly, until one day the whole thing gives way at once. The bus was the day it gave way. His mother, Patricia, had never warmed to me. She was the kind of woman who asked, within the first 10 minutes of meeting someone, what their father did for a living, and when I'd told her, sticking to the script, he owns a few boutique properties, she had given me a thin, assessing smile and changed the subject, the way you do when you've decided someone isn't worth your attention. His sister Bryn was worse. In the casual, oblivious way only a comfortable person can be cruel. At our engagement dinner, Bryn had asked me, in front of the whole table, whether I was worried about money, with Holt's student loans and everything, as if my entire financial existence orbited her brother's law school debt. I had let them believe it. That was the part that took me the longest to forgive myself for. Not the marrying of a man who turned out to be hollow at the center, but the years I'd spent quietly, allowing his family to treat me like a guest in my own life. Because correcting them would have meant admitting that some part of me had wanted desperately to be loved without my father's money standing behind me like a chaperone. I called my father 2 days after the bus. I want to be honest about why it took 2 days. It wasn't pride. Not exactly. It was that some small, stubborn part of me kept hoping Holt would notice on his own, that he'd come home from work, look at me differently, apologize without my having to lay the wound out for him to see. He didn't. He came home each night and ate dinner and complained about a colleague and asked, almost as an afterthought, how August was sleeping. And I realized I was waiting for a man who simply wasn't going to arrive. My father picked up on the second ring, the way he always did, like he kept the phone in his hand specifically for me. Addie. He still called me that, the nickname from before any of it, before I'd started building a second self out of half-truths. How's my grandson? He's good, Dad. My voice cracked on the second word, and I felt it travel down the line before I'd said anything else, the way fathers can hear a daughter's whole life in the sound of her breath. What happened? It wasn't a question. It never was with him. I told him. All of it, not just the bus but the 2 years underneath it, the slow erosion I'd talked myself out of seeing clearly until I was sitting on a city bus with stitches in my abdomen, and my son in my arms and nowhere left to put the truth except in front of someone who actually loved me. My father didn't raise his voice. He never did. He listened the way he listened to underperforming hotel managers, completely, without interruption, filing every detail away for later use. I'm sending Whitfield to pick you and August up tomorrow morning, he said finally. Pack what you need. You're coming to the lake house for a while. Whitfield, no relation, just a coincidence of names my father found endlessly funny, was his longtime executive assistant, a quiet, precise man in his 50s who had handled my father's calendar and correspondence for over 20 years. It was Whitfield's cell number I'd given the hospital as my emergency contact, back when I was admitted, because giving my father's direct line felt like leaving a trail. Holt had seen the contact card once, early in our marriage, and asked who W. Lang was. I'd told him it was my father's property manager, a man who sometimes helped coordinate things when my dad traveled. It wasn't even really a lie. It was just an incomplete one, like everything else I'd told him. That detail matters, I think, because people who hear this story later always ask the same question. How could Holt not have known? How could a man be married to someone for 2 years and not understand who her family was? The truth is that I made it remarkably easy for him not to know. I never lied about anything specific. I just curated, carefully, what he had access to. The way you might keep a door technically unlocked while making sure no one ever has a reason to open it. I left the next morning while Holt was at work. I didn't leave a dramatic note. I left a short text. August and I are staying with my dad for a while. We need to talk about what kind of marriage we're actually in. Then I packed 2 bags, gathered August's things, and waited by the window until I saw Whitfield's gray sedan pull up outside our building. The lake house sat on 40 acres outside Wayzata, a low, elegant structure of cedar and glass that my father had built the year after my mother died, when he said he needed somewhere quiet enough to remember her properly. I hadn't been back in almost a year. Holt found the drive inconvenient, and I had let that excuse stand in for 100 other things I wasn't ready to examine. My father met us at the door himself, which he almost never did. He's 71 now, silver-haired, still built like the man who used to swing a sledgehammer through drywall on his first renovation projects. And when he took August from my arms, his whole face changed in a way I hadn't seen since my mother was alive. "Hello, August Lang," he said softly, and I didn't correct the last name. Not yet. For the first week, I mostly slept. My father hired a postpartum doula to come twice a day, something I hadn't even known to ask Holt for, something that had simply never occurred to him to provide. I nursed August on the screened porch overlooking the lake, watching the water go from gray to gold and back to gray, and I let myself, for the first time in 2 years, stop performing the role of a woman with nothing behind her. Holt called 14 times in the first 3 days. I let most of them go to voicemail. The messages moved, predictably, from confused to annoyed to by day 4, something that almost resembled concern. "Addie, this is ridiculous. You can't just disappear with my son. Call me back." My son, I played that one twice, just to be sure I'd heard it right. He showed up on day 6. I hadn't told him the address. He got it from his mother, who'd gotten it from a mutual friend who happened to know my father owned property near Wayzata, though even she, I suspect, had no idea exactly what owned property meant in my father's case. I was on the porch with August when I heard the car in the gravel drive. Not the Range Rover, a rental. Something economy-sized and rattling, and I watched Holt get out and stand at the edge of the lawn, staring up at the house the way you'd stare at a building you suddenly understood you'd been wrong about. He'd clearly expected something smaller, a cabin maybe. Not glass walls and a boathouse and a dock stretching 100 feet into water so clean you could see the bottom. Addie. He came up the porch steps slowly, like the ground had become unfamiliar. "What is this place?" "It's my father's house. Your father owns a chain of motels." He said it like a question he already suspected the answer to. "Hotels," I said. 31 of them. He's built one in almost every city you've ever taken a work trip to, Holt. You've probably stayed in one without knowing it. I watched something move behind his eyes. Not guilt, not yet. Calculation. I'd seen that look on him before, at dinner parties, when someone mentioned a deal worth pursuing. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to know what it felt like to be chosen for myself," I said. And I found out. It felt like standing at a bus stop 5 days after major surgery while you went to your mother's house in my car. He had the decency at least to flinch. "That's not fair." "I didn't know." "You didn't know I had money," I said. "You knew I'd just had surgery. You knew I was in pain. You knew there was a perfectly good car sitting right there. None of that required you to know who my father was, Holt. It just required you to be a decent husband. You weren't. That's the part that actually matters." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the lake, and I watched him do something I recognized immediately, because I'd watched my college boyfriend do the exact same thing 8 years earlier. I watched him recalibrate. I watched him decide that this conversation could still be salvaged, that there was a version of the next 10 minutes where he apologized well enough to walk back into the life he'd assumed he could always return to. "I love you," he said. I love August. We can fix this. I'll do better. Date nights, more help around the house. I'll talk to my mother about the way she treats you. I'm not asking you to fix it, I said. I already saw what you do when you think no one's watching and nothing's at stake. That's not a problem you fix with a few date nights, Holt. That's just who you are when the cost of being unkind is low enough. So what, you're just done? Over one bus ride? It was never about the bus. I shifted August, who'd started to stir, against my shoulder. The bus was just the day I finally let myself see it clearly. You've been telling me who you are since the week we got engaged. When you let Bryn ask me about your student loans at my own engagement dinner. I just didn't want to believe it yet. I do now. He left an hour later after my father came out onto the porch, not threatening, never raising his voice, just present, the way a mountain is present, and asked, mildly, whether Holt would like to stay for dinner before his drive back. Holt declined. I think some part of him understood, standing there in the shadow of a house he'd had no idea existed, that the negotiation was already over, and had been over since the moment he'd pointed toward that bus stop and turned away. The divorce took 4 months, which my lawyer told me was unusually fast, though it didn't feel fast living through it. Holt's attorney tried briefly to argue for a more favorable settlement on the grounds that he hadn't known the extent of my family's wealth when he married me. As if ignorance of a number changed the math of how he'd treated the person standing in front of him. My lawyer, a woman my father had used for 30 years, sharp enough to make grown executives sweat, pointed out, not unkindly, that nothing in the prenuptial agreement Holt had signed before our wedding hinged on what he knew or didn't know about my father's holdings. He'd signed it because I'd asked him to, back when I told him it was something my cautious father insisted on for all his children, and he'd signed it without reading it closely, the way men who don't expect to need protection rarely do. He kept the Range Rover, oddly. I let him. I never wanted it back. It had never really felt like mine once he started driving it, and I'd already asked my father for something else. Something smaller, quieter, registered under my actual name this time, the name I'd been hiding from for longer than I wanted to admit. I see Holt sometimes, at handoffs, in parking lots of family-friendly restaurants, exchanging August's diaper bag and explaining nap schedules in the clipped, business-like tone two people develop when love has fully drained out of a relationship and only logistics remain. He's still polite. He's better with August than I expected, actually. In the limited windows he has him, he reads to him. He started taking him to the same indoor pool on Saturday evenings, and I let myself feel something close to relief about that, because whatever Holt failed to be as a husband, August deserves a father who at least tries. My father never said I told you so, though God knows he'd earned the right. What he did instead was simpler. He started coming to the lake house every Sunday that August and I were there, taking my son out onto the dock in a tiny orange life vest, narrating the names of birds neither of them could possibly remember, and once, watching them from the porch. I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before, that I had spent 2 years trying to be loved without my father's name attached. And the whole time, the love I actually needed had been right there, uncomplicated, asking nothing of me except to let it in. I changed my professional name back the spring after the divorce was finalized. Adeline Lang, no more borrowed surname, no more careful omissions at dinner parties. The interior design clients I'd built my small business with over the years didn't blink. Most of them, it turned out, hadn't cared at all who my father was. They'd hired me because I was good at the work, which was, in the end, the only thing I'd ever actually wanted someone to believe about me. Last month, my father opened his 32nd hotel, a quiet, elegant property on the Minneapolis riverfront, and at the ribbon cutting, surrounded by people who'd spent 20 years not knowing his name either, he pulled me aside and pressed a small velvet box into my hand. Inside was a set of keys to a corner office on the top floor, design director, a job I hadn't asked for and wasn't sure, at first, that I wanted. You don't have to take it, he said. But I'd like you to know it's yours either way. I think about the bus stop sometimes, the cold, the particular ache of stitches pulling with every step, the way I stood there and watched my husband's car disappear and felt, for one long, terrible moment, like the least important person in my own life. I don't think about it with anger anymore, not really. I think about it the way you think about a door that, once it finally closes, lets in enough light to see the rest of the house clearly for the first time. August turned 1 in September. We had the party at the lake house, on the lawn, with my father grilling burgers badly and laughing about it, and I stood at the edge of the dock with my son on my hip, watching the water catch the last of the summer light, and I understood, finally, that I had never needed to hide who I was to find out whether I was worth loving. I had just needed to stop handing that question to people who were never going to answer it honestly.